though it may be, we can live with our own consciences and not seek for keepers. The communists have started a fight with us. That fight may go on a long time. If they want to stop fighting, we shall certainly try to find peace with them. But if they push the fight to its bitter end, we shall not fail. Appendix: Military Psy-War Operations, 1950-53. On June 25, 1950, when the invasion of the Republic of Korea began, no real military Psy-War organization was tangibly evident. A planning staff headed by Colonel J. Woodall Green had been recreated in the Far East Command's GHQ in 1947, but it was hardly prepared to direct full-scale propaganda operations on such short notice, especially with a total lack of field operating units. Yet the staff, with hasty augmentation, did go into action in effect, became its own operating unit 2 days following the invasion, using both leaflets and radio in a strategic campaign that was continued without interruption for over 3 years. At the same time that General MacArthur made provision for the Psy-War planning staff in the Far East Command, the Department of the Army's G2 in 1947 directed the inauguration of a long-range program of extension courses to be administered primarily to the specialists of the Military Intelligence Reserve. One such specialty in the Military Intelligence Career Program was Psychological Warfare. 64 Parallel with the development of training literature based on World War II experience, the Army experimented with the use of Psy-War in field maneuvers. A special unit, called the Tactical Information Detachment 65, was formed at Fort Riley, Kansas. Organization of Field Operational Units. Less than a month after the 1950 invasion, the Department of the Army announced the approval of a new organizational concept for Psy-War field operational units. The new concept, profiting by the organizational happenchance in all theaters of operations during World War II, established 2 functional units, one for strategic propaganda support, the other for tactical propaganda support. Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group. Although the concept for new unit organization and function was not conceived overnight, FEC Psychological Warfare Section, PWS, with its dual planning and operating responsibilities, pointed up the urgent need for a unit properly manned and equipped to support full-scale strategic operations in any area. So the Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet, RBNL, group was born. Not only was it designed to conduct strategic propaganda in direct support of military operations, but it likewise was created to support the national worldwide propaganda effort when so directed. It was built on a basic framework of 3 companies, Headquarters and Headquarters Company, containing the command, administrative, supervisory and creative personnel necessary for propaganda operations. Reproduction Company, containing intricate equipment and skilled personnel capable of producing leaflets and newspapers of varying sizes and multiple color. Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, designed to replace or augment other means of broadcasting radio propaganda. In 1953 a 4th type company was activated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the Consolidation Company. This unit was very flexible and had the job of creating and conducting Psy-War in support of consolidation operations in areas under military government control. Figure 75, UN Propaganda. In some leaflets used in Korea, the United Nations emerged as a major point. Here UN lavishness to South Korea is contrasted with communist rapacity in the north. The scene does not remind the reader of slums on our side. Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company. The group's junior partner in the conduct of Psy-War support operations was the Loudspeaker and Leaflet, LNL, Company. This unit specifically supported an army in the field with adequate tactical propaganda support. Like the group, it supported the national propaganda objectives, but it interpreted the directives that came from the theater commander in terms of more immediate objectives. Its targets were smaller, lived under unusual circumstances, and presented highly vulnerable, rapidly changing propaganda opportunities, a real challenge for the LNL company. Organizationally, it was a trimmed-down version of the group. Its company headquarters and propaganda platoon were the offspring of headquarters and headquarters company. The publications platoon was a smaller, more adaptable version of reproduction company. And the loudspeaker platoon was the tactical counterpart of the strategic mobile radio broadcasting company. Figure 76, Korean leaflet bomb, early model. An M16A1 cluster adapter being loaded at the FEC printing plant in Yokohama, November 1, 1950. The bomb-type adapter will contain 22,500, 5x8, psychological warfare leaflets. The Tactical Information Detachment, moving from Fort Riley to Korea in the fall of 1950, was reorganized as the first loudspeaker and leaflet company and, attached to Yozak, served as 8th Army's tactical propaganda unit throughout the campaign. It adjusted its location, equipment, and propaganda tone to keep pace with the ups and downs of the Korean War. Psychological Warfare Center. Paralleling the creation of the Office of the Chief of Psychological Warfare in the Department of the Army, Psy-War training was started in the spring of 1951. A faculty was collected at the Army General School to start the world's first formal school of military propaganda. At the same time, reserve officers whose civilian specialties were in or related to mass communications were recalled to Psy-War assignments. Several RBNL groups and LNL companies were activated and trained at Fort Riley. One of these, the 1st Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group, was deployed to Japan to become the Strategic Propaganda Support Unit in FEC, thereby relieving the hard-pressed Psychological Warfare section of its operational functions. The group left Fort Riley in July 1951 at the height of the Missouri Valley floods, forcing the unit to take emergency detours by bus and train in order to meet its scheduled port of embarkation call. The first was the only group to have been used in active operations. Other groups were employed in training missions. In addition, reserve groups and companies trained periodically at key locations where sufficient specialized personnel were available to keep the units on a ready, standby basis. In April 1952, the Psy-War training activities at Fort Riley were moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the new Psychological Warfare Center was located. This center not only provided unit training supervision and facilities, but it fathered a new activity, the Psychological Warfare Board, designed to evaluate and test new Psy-War equipment and techniques. And the Psychological Warfare School, an outgrowth of the classes conducted by the Army General School, was formally recognized and established as one of the Army's specialist schools. More than 400 officers have received diplomas as Psy-War officers at the time of this writing, 1953. Most of the graduates have been Army officers, although successfully completing the course have been students from the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, U.S. Information Agency, and from 9 allied nations. Psychological Warfare Staff, FEC. For nearly 2 years, the Psychological Warfare Section operated under the General Staff Supervision of Intelligence, G2. Since World War I days, G2 had been given the responsibility for monitoring Psy-War activity, a practice that was evident throughout World War II. In 1947 the Department of the Army transferred the monitorship and supervision of Psy-War to Plans and Operations, G3. The shift was effected in FEC in 1952. Figure 77, UN Themes. This Korean language leaflet states, "No soldier would attempt to fight 54 men, yet Communist China is attempting to fight 54 nations. Don't fight for communist enslavement, join your comrades who have surrendered into safety." Early in 1953 PWS was transferred to the staff of the Commander, Army Forces Far East, AFFE, a paper transaction to put the staff in a closer position to coordinate the plans and operations of the supporting Army Psy-War units. Throughout the Korean conflict, PWS, like its area commander, wore two hats. PWS was also the Psy-War Operations Coordinating Agency for the United Nations Command. Broad objectives made possible throughout the war years the development of literally thousands of appropriate themes. One theme so prominent in World War II propaganda, that of unconditional surrender, was never used. UN policy denied its use, and PWS enforced the prohibition. Psychological Warfare Staff, USAC. Recognizing the need for Psy-War officers on Army and Corps staffs, the Department of the Army hastened to make an allocation for these officers to be integrated into headquarters structures. The Psy-War officers finally came to rest in the G3 Staff Section. 8th Army's Psy-War Division of G3 had the first loudspeaker and leaflet company under its operational control. USAC's Psy-War officer kept a tight control over the propaganda output of the LNL company by physically moving the propaganda platoon into his USAC staff office. Figure 78, Homefront Morale. When South Korean communications were interrupted, leaflets such as this provided an early boost to Korean civilian morale. Each of the Corps Psy-War officers had under his operational control one loudspeaker section, with a varying number of teams, from the LNL company. Radio operations. Radio in the Korean conflict was used jointly as a strategic and a consolidation medium. From the beginning of the war, radio was the voice of our military policy. An ambitious network, supervised in 1950-51 directly by PWS and thereafter by the 1st RBNL Group, became known and recognized as the voice of the United Nations Command. The Korean Broadcasting System, KBS, and the Japan Broadcasting System, JBS, transmitted on a cooperative basis, with the U.S. government buying airtime. The 1st RBNL Group's radio unit furnished programming assistance through key stations in Seoul, KBS, Daegu, KBS, Busan, KBS, and Tokyo, JBS. In addition, the group furnished technical assistance to KBS in order to keep as many as 12 network stations on the air. Leaflet operations. As in World War II, leaflets were delivered primarily by two means, aircraft and artillery. B-29s of the Far East Air Force ferried leaflet bombs on night missions deep into strategic areas. Light bombers and liaison craft in support of USAC dropped both leaflet bombs and bundles on tactical targets. The leaflet bundle was a Korean War development. It was wrapped, tied, and fused in such a manner that it would open and release its leaflets in mid-air. The 105 mm howitzer remained the principal artillery piece for placing propaganda-loaded shells on pinpoint targets. Tremendous quantities of leaflets were printed. The 1st RBNL Group on many occasions averaged better than 20 million pieces of printed propaganda every week. To this, the 1st LNL company in Korea added an average of 3.5 million leaflets per week. Loudspeaker operations. The airborne loudspeaker was the object of experimentation, but the bulk of loudspeaker broadcasts were made from vehicle mounts, such as tanks, and from emplacements. During the static battle situation of 1951-53, most of the broadcasts were of the latter kind. Range of the voice casts was short, something like 2,000 yards under ideal conditions. Personnel and equipment were supplied by the 1st LNL company, and scripts were prepared by Psy-War Division, G3, USAC. Results of military Psy-War operations. When the question was asked, just how effective was Psy-War, the answer was vague. Clear-cut immediate evaluation of the effects of each propaganda campaign was often impossible to ascertain because of the many intangible conditions that were prevalent in the target area, conditions that were constantly changing. Some critics of the Psy-War operations in the Far East Command charged that there were exaggerated claims of prisoners of war who surrendered as a result of propaganda. They pointed out that a head count of prisoners is an inaccurate measure of direct effects of Psy-War used in support of military operations, because rarely is the taking of prisoners the sole goal of any major Psy-War campaign. Other critics expressed the belief that emphasis had been placed on quantity rather than quality of propaganda. By quantity they meant propaganda measured by bookkeeping statistics. By quality they meant propaganda that, planned with potent intelligence, was capable of exploiting propaganda opportunities with maximum psychological impact. Did Psy-War achieve its goal? The effects of planned persuasion in 1,000 days of radio broadcasts, in tens of thousands of loudspeaker appeals, in billions of leaflets, may be measured only in retrospect. The question may be answered when reaction in the target area has reached, or fails to reach, favorable proportion, provided that the tangible results of the military operations can be clearly separated from those of concurrent and subsequent strategic international information operations. Figure 79, the famous airplane surrender leaflet. This is the controversial Far East Command leaflet that in April 1953 offered the sum of $50,000 to any pilot who delivers a modern, operational, combat-type jet aircraft in flyable condition to South Korea. The first pilot who delivers such a jet aircraft to the free world will receive an additional $50,000 bonus for his bravery. The leaflet was printed in 3 languages: Russian, Chinese and Korean. In this example of the Russian language leaflet, there are added notations in both Korean and Chinese that this is a message from the Americans to any jet pilot who can read Russian. If you know such a person, please give it to him. It tells him how to escape to the UN forces. Footnotes: 1. Histories of warfare, of politics, though there are no good recent ones, Edward Jenks' little book being half a century out of date, of political theory, especially the excellent though dissimilar volumes by G. H. Sabina and by G. E. C. Catlin, of particular countries, of diplomacy, of religion, and even of literature, all cast a certain amount of light on the subject. No writer known to the author specializes in the topic of historical propaganda, none takes up the long-established historical role of nonviolent persuasion in warfare. Some of the sociologists and anthropologists, such as Karl Mannheim, Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, Jeffrey Gorer, Ruth Benedict, to mention a few at random, have presented approaches which would justify re-evaluations of history in a way useful to propaganda students, but they have not yet persuaded the historians to do the work. 2-7 Judges 22-23. 3 Leon Weger, S.J., Textes historiques, Xianxian, 1929, Volume 1, pages 628-633. 4. The author's attention to this reference was drawn by an unpublished undated typescript article in the War Department files by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel T. Mackle, INF 5 Lo Quan Chung, San Kuo Chi Yen I, translated by C. H. Brewitt Taylor as San Kuo or Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Shanghai, 1929, Volume 1, p. 46. 6. Recent writers on Genghis, such as Lam, Vladimirtsov, Fox, and Lattimore, all credit the Mongols with a higher technological level of warfare than has been the custom among most Western historians. H. G. Wells' simple but compelling description of the Mongols in his Outline of History is worth rereading in this connection. 7. Pettis de la Croix, The History of Genghis Khan the Great, First Emperor of the Antient Moguls and Tartars, London, 1722, p. 154. 8. Benedict Ficken, Historia Fanaticorum, Danzig, 1664. 9. Philip Davidson's Propaganda and the American Revolution, Chapel Hill, 1941, is a careful scholarly study of this period. Comparable studies have not yet been written concerning other American wars. Military and civilian historians have a fascinating piece of research awaiting them in the material concerning Confederate and Federal psychological warfare. Each participant in the Civil War was vulnerable to the propaganda of the other. Subversive and clandestine pro-Confederate propaganda in the North is outlined in George Fort Milton's engrossing Abraham Lincoln and the Fifth Column, New York and Washington, D.C., 1942, but no comparable study covering all forms of propaganda on either side is yet available. 10 various new editions of Paine's chief works are available in popular and inexpensive form. They are worth study as good propaganda. 11 in his The Political Doctrines of Sun Yat-sen, Baltimore, 1937, page 17 and following, this author attempted to present some of the relationships of ideology to other methods of social control and, in connection with that enterprise, was furnished by the philosopher, A.O. Lovejoy, with a definition of ideology more systematic and more elaborate than the one used here. 12 For example, in the 1920s the Soviet press expressed resentment and amusement over a ruse adopted by the British during the course of operations along the northwest frontier. Plane-mounted loudspeakers had told the tribesmen, in Pashto, that God was mad at them for having broken the pledged peace, with the result that they scattered and gave up. This maneuver exasperated the Russians, who themselves were making equally sweeping propaganda inroads on the other side of the Pamirs. The Russians were attacking religion, and having heavy going, it struck them as improper warfare to make use of local superstition. 13 Webster's New International Dictionary, 2nd edition, Springfield, 1944. 14 The late Huey Long is reported to have created a new word in the language of rustic Louisiana, the word damnlaying newspapers. By instilling in his followers contempt for the capitalist press, he got them to the point where they disbelieved anything which they saw in print, and believed everything which old Huey, the kingfish himself told them. This operation was technically competent, since one of the most effective means of putting propaganda across is to draw alarmed attention to unfriendly propaganda and then just happening to mention the truth, that is, the promoted side. Long attributed to the newspapers a large number of lies which they did not print, along with the lies, which were in historical fact true, that they did actually print. Since most of his followers either boycotted the press or read it in a hostile frame of mind, they never found out whether the newspapers said what Huey said they said, or not. You can try this out on your neighbors or friends by making up some idiotic quotation, such as, the Jewish Vorwärts says that pickled onions are a cause of immorality, or Le Temps of Paris says that Alaska is preparing to secede, and the listener will be so busy scoffing at what the paper allegedly said that he will take no time to find out whether the paper did say it or not. Such attributions occur in everyday life. The smart propagandist attributes plenty of rich, ripe, silly quotations to his opponent. How many people actually know what the communists have said on any given topic? Or bother to check on the actual claims of the Zionist organization? Or the statements of the Arabs in Palestine? 15 The literature in this field is carefully described in 2 volumes by a 3-man team consisting of Harold D. Laswell, Ralph D. Casey and Bruce Lons Smith, the first being Propaganda and Promotional Activities, an annotated bibliography, Minneapolis, 1935, and the sequel being Propaganda, Communication, and Public Opinion, a comprehensive reference guide, Princeton, 1946. The book lists provide material in plenty for any academic-minded inquirer. The essays in the 2 volumes are well worth reading, although the authors have undergone the professorial delight of inventing a private language of their own. Parts of the latter book, especially, read like proceedings out of an unfamiliar lodge meeting, but there is sound sense and acute observation behind the vocabulary. It must, however, be parenthetically noted that during World War II the key propaganda jobs were held by a radio commentator, a dramatist, a newspaperman, a New York banker, and an absolutely astonishing number of men from commercial radio along, of course, with a sprinkling of Army and Navy officers in Washington, and a heavy majority of non-specialist officers in the field. The propaganda experts were not, in most instances, called in to do the actual chore of propaganda. Among the exceptions were Leonard W. Dubh, author of Propaganda, Its Psychology and Technique, New York, 1935, who served in the War Department's Psychological Warfare Branch and in the Washington Propaganda Center at OWI, C. A. H. Thompson, who served as a propaganda staff officer both in Washington and overseas after being a collaborator with the Laswell Group, and Drs. Edwin Guthrie and A. L. Edwards, whose chapter Psychological Warfare in E. G. Boring, editor Psychology for the Fighting Man, Washington, 1943, pages 430 to 447, is a lucid epitome of the topic. 16. This means that if you want to get baptized, you've got to get all the way under the water or it doesn't count. 17. See Dubh's book, mentioned above, especially pages 71 through 89 and 413 through 417. 18. See the bibliographies by Harold Laswell and others, mentioned above, for a wealth of literature giving more technical and scientific breakdowns than this. The formula STASM represents what was actually used in preparation of up-to-the-minute propaganda spot analysis for the War Department General Staff by Propaganda Branch during World War II. Some further aspects of this formula are presented in my article, STASM, Psychological Warfare and Literary Criticism in the South Atlantic Quarterly, Volume 46, Number 3, July 1947, pages 344 to 348. 19. See Harold Laswell's Propaganda Technique in the World War, New York, reissue 1938, Chapter 2, Propaganda Organization, for a description of the attempts to coordinate policy and propaganda in World War I. 20 Chicago, 1946. The discussion of what censorship authorities regarded as propaganda material possessing value for the enemy, of the wartime OCOWI relationship, and of censorship of shortwave broadcasts are of particular interest to the student of psychological warfare. 21. In a somewhat different context, it is interesting to note that Chinese Protestant churches, made up of Chinese church members, like to hire ministers who mouth their Chinese with a strong American accent. The American missionaries established the American accent as part of the liturgical paraphernalia of Protestantism, and the Chinese preachers trained under them accepted the American mispronouncing of Chinese as a part of the religion. It is odd to see a church full of Chinese using absolutely unbelievable tones while singing hymns or making appropriate individual responses. At that, they are no funnier than the Chinese Buddhists, who memorize long Indian sutras without understanding a single syllable. 22. On World War I, see Harold Laswell's Propaganda Technique in the World War, previously cited, George Creel's How We Advertised America, New York and London, 1920, the very title of which is an indication of its chief shortcoming, Lieutenant Colonel W. Nikolai, Nachrichten Ernst, Presse und Volksstimmung im Weltkrieg, Berlin, 1920, by the German General Staff Officer chiefly responsible for staff work on propaganda and public opinion, a very thoughtful though prejudiced book, Heber Blankenhorn's enjoyable little classic, Adventures in Propaganda, Boston, 1919. Blankenhorn was the only American officer to see field service in propaganda in both wars, as a captain in I and a lieutenant colonel in II, and George G. Brunt's scholarly monograph Allied Propaganda and the Collapse of the German Empire in 1918, Stanford, 1938. Readers desiring further references should consult the bibliographies by Lasswell, Casey, and Smith, cited above. 23 Colonel Nicolai, book cited in footnote 1, pages 160 to 161. 24 For a pro-Hitler view of the world, see Wyndham Lewis Hitler, London, 1931, if a copy is to be found. The author would probably prefer for the book to disappear. It is an eloquent, very pro-Nazi book, putting the Hitlerite terminology into the English language and what is more important, infusing into the clumsy German pattern of thinking and feeling a lightness of touch which makes Nazism more palatable. The book converted no one in its time, and is not apt to do harm at this late date, but it will make the English reading reader understand some of the novelty, the revolutionary freshness, the bold unorthodoxy which made millions of people turn to Hitlerism as an escape from the humdrum heartbreak of Weimar Germany. Much of the book is devoted to the problem of power street fighting, mass demonstrations, slogans, symbolisms which so fascinated the Nazis. 25 See Carl J. Friedrich, The New Belief in the Common Man, Brattleboro, Vermont, 1945, Chapter 3, Independence of Thought and Propaganda, pages 81 to 120, for a cogent discussion of this mentality. The present author, In Government in Republican China, New York, 1938, pages 18 to 23, describes in epitome the method whereby the ancient Confucian leadership of China, while propaganda conscious, used ideology as an economical, stable method of control and avoided its maleficent features. In one of the few poorly argued passages of a great work, Arnold J. Toynbee overlooks this peculiar characteristic of Confucianism and merely equates the Confucian dogma with those of other universal churches. A Study of History, London, 1939, Volume V, especially pages 654 to 5. 26 People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR, Report of Court Proceedings in the Case of the Anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, Verbatim Report, Moscow, 1937, page 111. These trials were themselves propaganda, in this particular instance, propaganda of a rather poor order, since they failed to convince the foreign public and presumably persuaded only those portions of the Russian public who were so gullible that they needed no further persuading. For a brilliant illumination of them in terms of a readable novel, see Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon, New York, 1941. The same author also has a book of essays on the totalitarian mentality under the rather fancy title, The Yogi and the Commissar, New York, 1945. On the same subject, see Louis Fisher's Men and Politics, New York, 1942. 27 This document establishing the KOI, along with the other major documents pertaining to American psychological warfare, may be found in J. P. Warburg's book cited above, Unwritten Treaty. 28 In the course of a routine day of work on overseas propaganda in 1942, the author, who was then in SSG of Miss, found it necessary to get in touch with military intelligence proper, naval intelligence, the State Department, the Office of the Assistant to the President, the Office of Facts and Figures, the British Political Warfare Group, which was vainly seeking its American opposite number, the Office of Civilian Defense, the Research and Analysis Branch of the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the Office of the Librarian of Congress, the Foreign Information Service, and the Department of Agriculture. Each of these either operated propaganda, or had policy or intelligence contributions to make. The Board of Economic Warfare naturally came into the field too. This was during a period of German and Japanese victories, so that even if propaganda had been coordinated, it probably would not have been much more effective than it was. From what could be figured out later, no real harm was done at this time. Nor was much achieved. 29 The bibliographies are cited above, on page 38. The journal comes out, as its title indicates, 4 times a year. It is published by the School of Public and International Affairs, Princeton University, Princeton, NJ. Every major library has it. The review section provides a good survey of new writing in the field. Journals such as the American Political Science Review, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the Infantry Journal, and the American Historical Review often have significant articles or book reviews in this field. International Affairs, Royal Institute for International Affairs, London, has excellent reviews of books arranged by geographic subheads. Opinion and propaganda topics are usually lumped together in academic studies. Material on the one is apt to lead to the other. 30 San Zuching, translated and annotated by Herbert A. Giles, Shanghai, 1910, pages 2 and 3. The translation quoted is not by Giles. 31 On the transmitting side, nothing could be more ruinous than mere translation, the more literal the worse, of a single basic broadcast for all audiences irrespective of language or culture. For the text of war communiques or of official documents, this is permissible, but for news or feature broadcasts, few things could be worse. It is not possible to translate subtle psychological appeals embedded in news or commentary. Such materials by their nature must follow forms acceptable to the audience, building up confidence with familiar allusions and creating a sense of oneness between the actual announcer and his listeners. Equivalence can be worked out. The same basic policies can be transposed. The same source of news and intelligence can be exploited. But the actual program cannot be translated verbatim from one language to another. It must be transposed not only from one language but from one culture to another. 32 Free advertisement. 33 Bad news about his side is not necessarily the only kind of bad news for the enemy to know. Gloomy news about our side can harm the enemy listener if his government is running a propaganda campaign to raise production, promote thrift, etc., by claiming things are worse on their side. In such a case, good news about us would be good for him. News must be fitted to the propaganda plan and to the propaganda situation. 34 Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, was first published in New York in 1922, but it is still clean-cut as a basic statement of the problems of public opinion. The author's own life as a commentator is remarkable in fulfilling the mission which he implicitly set himself when writing about public opinion, the job of lifting issues into emotional and psychological contexts in which the resulting judgment will be based on socially sound factors. 35 The American newspapers between 1942 and 1945 carried intermittent accounts of these personal and political problems, frequently in the columns of commentators rather than in the regular news sections. The book by Warburg is of course unwritten treaty, mentioned above. 36 For popular histories of the OSS, see Sub Rosa, The OSS and American Espionage by Stuart Alsop and Thomas Braden, New York, 1946, or Corey Ford and Alastair McBain, Cloak and Dagger, New York 1946. An exciting thriller novel by Darwin Teelhead gives an oblique and guarded description of black propaganda and clandestine polling, The Fear Makers, New York, 1945. Teelhead was himself in OSS. For an interesting description of OSS field operations, see Nicole Smith's Into Siam, New York, 1946. OSS was picturesque from the very start, and it is likely that other participants in OSS work will from time to time bring out books on their adventures. 37 Bureau of the Budget, United States Government Manual, 1946, First edition, Washington, 1946, says of the Military Intelligence Division, it has charge of propaganda and psychological warfare, page 198. The fiat may be a little more precise than circumstances warrant, but it at least shows where, for the record, psychological warfare belonged. 38 See Charles E. Merriam's study, Political Power, Chicago, 1933, and his later works for suggestive approaches to the political setting of propaganda problems. He developed the terms Miranda and credenda for modern political science usage. 39 While this statement is plainly a matter of individual opinion, the author considers that his own experience supports his opinion in this instance. He wrote plans on almost every operating level in the governmental and military hierarchy during World War II, all the way from drafting plans for the joint, American, and combined, British-American, chiefs of staff down to helping field agents in the China theater work out practical little propaganda plans for their own missions, or planning the writing, use, and classification of leaflets one by one, in collaboration with OWI operators. He found planning to be fascinating at the top, and worthwhile at the bottom of the pyramid, but he found no significant correlation between the top and the bottom, save in the sense which he makes plain. 40 In the pseudo-technical propaganda slang of the OWI people, this was called spelling out. The same people stockpiled campaigns to needle the enemy. 41 So far as he knows, the author was the first about May of 1942 to urge that a surrender pass be made to look like an official document, with banknote type engraving and with formal style. Unfortunately, it was printed in green, instead of the old-fashioned orange gold of the U.S. Treasury yellowbacks, and was sent to the jungle areas of the South and Southwest Pacific, where everything was green to start with. 42 These suggestions are based on the comment of Major Martin Hearse, who prepared the leaflets at Anzio Beach Head and subsequently was leaflet expert at Chafe. 43 No author, publisher, place, or date. Issued by the unit. The reference is to page 55. 44 The Department of the Army is understood to be preparing a field manual and technical manual for psychological warfare which will describe the doctrines and the equipment, respectively, to be used in combat propaganda situations. 45 In the post-war period a great many reflective publications began to appraise what had happened in the Psy-war field. One of the best of these is Daniel Lerner's Psych-War, Psychological Warfare Against Germany, D-Day to VE-Day, New York, 1949, which covers the European operation in detail. This was followed by Propaganda in War and Crisis, edited by Daniel Lerner, New York, 1951. A heavier work, covering many of the same problems is The Language of Politics, by Harold D. Laswell, Nathan Leites, and Associates, New York, 1949. Leonard Dubb's work on propaganda, long the leading American text in the field, was issued in a revised, post-war edition, New York, 1948. The post-war book does much to put psychological warfare in perspective. A simpler text than Dubb's, useful for less advanced students, is Frederick C. Irion's Public Opinion and Propaganda, New York, 1950. A manual directly pertaining to psychological warfare is America's Weapons of Psychological Warfare edited by Robert E. Summers, New York, 1951. This also contains a bibliography which is helpful to the layman. 3 outstanding works summarize the post-war propaganda position of the U.S. government. Charles A. H. Thompson's Overseas Information Service of the United States Government, Washington, 1950, shows the continuity of the problem from war to peace. Wallace Carroll's Persuade or Perish, Boston, 1948, argues the necessity of maintaining an opinion offensive, and Edward Barrett's illuminating discussion, Truth is Our Weapon, New York, 1953, brings the story down to the Eisenhower administration. 46 new insights into the nature of the Soviet antagonist were presented by 3 related monographs originally prepared inside RAND Corporation, the research facility which often works with the U.S. Air Force. Nathan Lightas, The Operational Code of the Politburo, New York, 1951, digests Soviet fundamentals of international behavior. Margaret Mead's Soviet Attitudes Toward Authority, New York, 1951, applies anthropological and psychiatric methods of analysis. This book, to the military or general reader, should be prefaced by reading her distinguished work, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, which is now available in an inexpensive, paper-bound reprint, Mentor Books, New York, 1952. Philip Selznick makes the point that organization is itself a communist power-achieving instrument in his The Organizational Weapon, New York, 1952, the third of the RAND Group. Lieutenant Colonel William R. Kintner, a regular Army officer, prepared the challenging study of the specific military content of communist thinking in The Front is Everywhere, Norman, Oklahoma, 1950. Among the many good recent books about the communist challenge, R. N. Carew Hunt, The Theory and Practice of Communism, New York, 1951, is outstanding for its dispassionateness, while James Burnham's The Coming Defeat of Communism, New York, 1951, is a ringing appeal to our side to meet the challenge. Stephen T. Posany, In a Century of Conflict, Chicago, 1953, presents the most coldly damning and most far-ranging critique of communist operations which this writer has seen. Wilmore Kendall rendered Americans a service with his careful translation, editing and introduction of A. Rossi, A Communist Party in Action, New Haven, 1949, while Bob Dark, in a British counterpart, gives a less intellectual and much abbreviated description of the British communist setup and operations in the Communist Technique in Britain, London, 1952. Communist Revelations of Capitalist Conspiracies, which tell more about the haunted, anxious, nasty minds of the communists than about our own operations, are, among others, L. Natarajan, American Shadow over India, Bombay, 1952, and Jean Cathala, They Are Betraying Peace, Moscow, 1951. 47. Paul M. A. Linebarger, Communism as a Competing Civilization in Southeast Asia, A Contribution to Southeast Asia in the Coming World, Philip W. Thayer, Editor, Baltimore, 1952. 48. For a contrary point of view, see the works by Harry Stack Sullivan, Brock Chisholm, and others. 49. Problematical in all such attempts of working officers to define victory is the serious intellectual issue of avoiding means which by themselves defeat the ends which are sought. If the means are dangerous or immoral by the standards of the society which applies them, their value becomes low indeed. For the covered side of U.S. operations, see the breezy and popular volumes on OSS, Lieutenant Colonel Corey Ford and Major Alastair McBain, Cloak and Dagger, The Secret Story of OSS, New York, 1946, Stuart Alsop and Thomas Braden, Sub Rosa, The OSS and American Espionage, New York, 1946, and the most vividly concrete narration of the group, Elizabeth P. MacDonald, Undercover Girl, New York, 1947. For an astonishing work which seems to violate security on every page, see Commander Roy Olin Stratton, Sacco the Rice Paddy Navy, Pleasantville, NY, 1950. This is the description of a Navy group in China which the author shows to be more covert than OSS itself. A dry, German view of Anglo-American espionage in Holland is given in that superb, true-life adventure story, H. J. Giskey's, London Calling North Pole, London and New York, 1953. 50. See the works of Frida Utley, Herbert Fays, the Linebarger Jangberg's political science text, New York, 1954, and others, not to mention the contributions by Mao, Liu Shaochi, and other communist leaders. 51. The author himself pleads guilty to having criticized the French unduly without accepting a reasonable share of U.S. responsibility for the situation in Indochina. Paul M. A. Linebarger, Indochina, The Bleeding War, Combat Forces Journal, March 1951, and was deservedly rebuked from some French readers for his denigration of French imperialism. The author cannot endorse as wise, shrewd, or kind the French political decisions in Indochina, but he can say that the Americans who made, or failed to make, basic policy concerning that area have been as irresponsible and foolish as the French. He trusts that, by the time this note reaches print, a more effectual Franco-American understanding will have replaced the previous difficulties. 52. Psychological warfare is, of course, neither very psychological nor is it necessarily warfare. Indeed, within the context of a rigidly purist and scholastic definition, psychological warfare is not psychological, in that most of its operations are very definitely not a part of present-day scientific psychology. Neither is it warfare because it can be operated before war, during war, after war, or contemporaneously with and apart from war. As pointed out above, war involves the inescapable content of public lawful violence. It is hard to ascribe violence to a shortwave broadcast or to a leaflet. In Korea in 1951, the author heard that a Chinese soldier was found dead mashed by a leaflet bomb which had failed to explode at the proper altitude. If this story is true, that particular soldier was one of the few genuine war victims of military or strategic propaganda, both so pretentiously called psychological warfare by Americans of the mid-20th century. Anthony Leviero, who summarized American Psy-War in the New York Times in a series of articles between December 9 and December 14, 1951, is both an experienced general staff officer and a first-class newspaper man. His comment in 1953 on the new Operations Coordinating Board was encouraging or ominous. He stated in his Times dispatch of September 4, 1953 that the William Jackson Committee had found that psychological warfare did not exist as such. If this meant that the new OCB was to sweep aside the limitations of top-secret pedantic definitions and move toward a refreshingly concrete manipulation of the world's scene, the news was encouraging indeed. If the new board was, however, to be dedicated to the manufacture of new, complicated, and secret definitions of its own, the news was bad. Given the time lag on the declassification of government materials, it may be 25 years, or 1978, before the precise definitions of 1953 are available to the public. The tendency of the board to succeed or to fail will be evident by the time this material is in print. Given the personalities involved, the prognosis appeared optimistic. 53. This kind of issue has not been neglected in our public discussions or our schools. Two sides of one famous case are given in Owen Lattimore, Ordeal by Slander, New York, 1951, and the bitterly anti-Lattimore book by John T. Flynn, The Lattimore Story, New York, 1953. A serious intelligent attempt to answer some of the problems posed by Psy-War and the resulting loyalty issues within a democracy are the works of Nathaniel Whale, Treason, The Story of Disloyalty and Betrayal in American History, Washington, 1950, and The Battle Against Disloyalty, New York, 1951. A formidable presentation of what the communists are doing is offered in Ralph de Toledano, Spies, Dupes, and Diplomats, New York and Boston, 1952, and in Major General Charles A. Willoughby, Shanghai Conspiracy, New York, 1952. The kind of round table often intellectually conceived and executed within American schools is well portrayed in the special issue of Columbia Journal of International Affairs, New York, Spring, 1951, in which the entire issue is given to a synthesis of international problems in the propaganda field under the heading Propaganda and World Politics. Stefan Pausanias Magi's Trala Century of Conflict, Chicago, 1953, provides an excellent general framework. 54 Nothing in previous U.S. experience prepared Americans for the invasion of the individual personality which has long been accomplished by the Communists but which was first publicized in adequate fashion after the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The pioneer book in this field, and still the best, is Edward Hunter's Brainwashing in Red China, New York, 1951. This author has known Mr. Hunter for 20-odd years and can vouch for him as a man with a sober respect for fact. Though he does have a vivid taste in adjectives, he has seen not only Mr. Hunter but has gone over some of the raw material which Hunter used and can testify to the reality and sympathy with which Hunter portrays this rather gruesome process. On a different scale, Wilbur Scram has given a description of what happens when the Reds take a city, New Brunswick, 1951, in a book of that name written jointly with John W. Riley. 55 A sharp contrast between the old politics and the new is shown by the unfortunate book prepared in the Department of State and now hastily, even guiltily, allowed to go out of print by the United States government printing office because it showed that some Americans were guilty or naive enough to try to love and trust the Soviet state within the same system as our own. One does not know whether to laugh or to weep at the spectacle of men lamenting the fact that they were once innocent and hopeful. The book, prepared by the late Harley Notter and others, is Department of State Publication 3580, General Policy Series 15, Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation, Washington, 1949. That not all was innocence, even when things so seemed, is amply attested by Frida Utley's controversial but brilliant summary, The China Story, Chicago, 1951. 56 The function of decision-making has been brilliantly though solemnly explored in Richard C. Snyder, H. W. Bruck and Burton Sapin, Decision-Making as an Approach to the Study of International Politics, Princeton, N.J., 1954. 57 For a contrary point of view, see Tensions That Lead to War, edited by Hadley Cantrell, Princeton, 1950. 58 The author had the opportunity of observing upsurge in the Korean War on 3 different occasions, September 1950, March 1951, and November and December 1952 and early January 1953. He visited Korea itself twice and also spent a great deal of time, part of it in a public capacity and part of it as a freelance author, in the periphery of that war areas such as Hong Kong, Indochina, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, and India. 59 Several novels have touched on Psy-war problems. The most hard-hitting of the lot is Jerome Weidman, Too Early to Tell, New York, 1946. Covert Psy-war whispering techniques are thinly disguised and much improved, technically, in Darwin Thielhet, The Fear Makers, New York, various dates. The covert side of some of these adventures is portrayed, among others, by W. Stanley Moss, A War of Shadows, New York, 1952, Ray Franklin Kaufman, The Coconut Wireless, New York, 1948, and Chin Ki-an, Silent Army, New York, 1953. As exciting as fiction are Mark Gain and John Caldwell, American Agent, New York, 1947, describing the work of an enthusiastic amateur, and L. C. Moises, Operation Cicero, New York reprint, 1952, portraying a first-class professional. Alexander Foote, Handbook for Spies, London, 1949, and J. V. Davidson Houston, Armed Pilgrimage, London 1949, are interesting distillations of personal experience which touch on espionage and Psy-war. 60. The author professes he would like to write a preliminary work on this subject himself someday, if no one else essays the task first. 61. V equals Victory Day. 62. Edward Hunter, Brainwashing in Red China, New York, 1951. 63. If one good book can be mentioned without prejudice to the many other good books in the same field, attention can be drawn to the excellent undergraduate text which explores the present U.S. position on the press, George I. Bird and Frederick E. Merwin, The Press and Society, New York, 1951. At the opposite end of the spectrum, see Oleg Anisimov, The Ultimate Weapon, New York, 1953. The first book takes the U.S. as it is and does not envisage profound responses coming as the inevitable accompaniment of frightful change. The second book states the outside problem in shocking terms, but asks of Americans things which neither they nor their press are ever apt to approve. 64. The development of this activity was handed to the Chief of Army Field Forces, in whose G2 section Colonel Donald Hall was the Psy-war officer. The first of these courses with its supporting textbook was not ready for release by the Army General School until 1949, just 1 year before the Korean conflict began. In 1949 likewise appeared the first officially approved Army Field Manual on the subject of psychological warfare support of military operations. 65 teams from this detachment, armed with leaflets and loudspeakers, were sent to and participated in major maneuvers in continental United States, in the Caribbean area, and in Hawaii. These teams were attached to the enemy forces, and exposed the maneuver troops to military propaganda in action. The Tactical Information Detachment suddenly suspended its planning of simulated propaganda operations for Exercise Pluto in 1950. As the only Psy-war operational unit in the Army, the detachment was hustled off to Korea. Index Abbeville, 164 Adams, Samuel, 23 Adipati, 185 Aggression, Timing, 43 Aims, Long Range, 126 Air Dropping, 229 Air Rescue, 142, 231 Air Support, 228 aircraft, World War I, 69 Allen, George, 271 Alsop, Joseph, 273 Alsop, Stewart, 182 American Association of Public Opinion Research, 290 American Broadcasting Station in Europe, 270, 288 American Expeditionary Forces, 67. See also Pershing's Headquarters American Operations, Effects, 103 American Policy in Indochina, 260 to 262 American Revolution, 21 Black Leaflet, 20 American-Russian Meeting, 202 Anderson, Hans Christian, 156 Anger Motif, 233 Annamites, 263 Announcers, Radio, 58 Anti-Communist Appeals, 246 Anti-Semitic Propaganda, 138 Anzio, 82, 212, 239 Appeals, Black Action, 237 Armed Forces Radio Service, 272 Armed Forces Radio Stations, 34 Army Air Forces, 183 Army Forces, Far East, 305 Army General School, 304 Aryan Myth, 78 Aryan Racialism, 25 Asia, Communism in, 251 Athenians, 7 Atrocities, 46, 79 Attu, 214 Audience, 123 Austria, 184 Azad Hind, 185 Azad Hind Fauj, 8 Aztecs, 17 Bakunin, Mikhail, 297 Balkan states, 163 balloons, 21, 69 Barrett, Edward W., 271 Bataan, 223 Beaverbrook, Lord, 64 Belgium, 13 Belly Tank, 170 Benedict, Ruth, 3 Bengal, 8 Benton, William, 184, 271 Black Counter-Propaganda, 148 Black, Lieutenant Colonel Percy, 91 Black Propaganda, 44, 88 Blaine, James G., 49 Blankenhorn, Heber, 64. 67 Boers, 24 Bolshevik, 71 Bombs Leaflet Bombs, 172, 192 VL, 130, 237 V2, 237 Bonus Troubles, 214 Book That Won the War, 23 Bows, Subhas Chandra, 8 Boxes, Packing, 171 Braden, Thomas, 182 Brainwashing, 295 FF Breakdown of Propaganda Items, 122 Brest-Litovsk, 71 Brewitt-Taylor, ch. 8 Britain in 1940, 163 British, 81 British Admiralty, 87 British Broadcasting Company, 45, 82, 87 British Foreign Office, 64, 87 British in Indochina, 260 British Psychological Warfare, 263 to 264 British War Office, 87 Brogan, Dennis W., 277 Brown, Don, 208 Bras Tito, Josip, 87, 89 Bruns, George G., 64 Buchan, John, 64 Bulgaria, 132 Bullock, General William, 266 Burton, Captain J.A., 37 Burma, 23, 24, 168, 185, 209, 224. See also North Burma Buttles, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, 97 Belorussia, 13 Cambodia, 186, 262 Canton, 96 Cantrell, Hadley, 290 Capabilities, Psychological, 158 Capacity, Own, 164 Caribbean Pirates, 17 Casablanca, 47 Casey, Ralph D., 38 Catholicism, 260 Catlin, GEC, 3 Censorship, Russian, 105 Central Intelligence Agency, 274, 276 Central Intelligence Group, 115, 184 Central Pacific, 187 Chandler, Douglas, 83 Changes of Nations in Wartime, 292 to 293 Chaika, 225 Chiang Kai-shek, 52, 75, 223 China, 5, 15. 185, 227, 255 to 257 Central China, 1944, 163 Communist China, 47, 52, 106, 204 Japanese garrisons in, 58 Organization, 170 Reorganized National Government, 185 OWI in, 57 Protestant churches in, 59 Revolution of 1927, 75 Chungking Government, 106 China-Burma India Theater, 10, 98 Forward Echelon Headquarters, 57 China Theater, 187, 213 Chinese Communists, 262 to 263, 265, 289, 294 Chinese Federal Reserve Bank, 141 Chinese prisoners, 288 Chinese railway campaigns, 209 Christmas cards, 213 Churchill. Winston, 24, 87, 157 Cinema, 210 Civil Defense, 251 Civil Information and Education Section, 189 Civilians, Friendly, 209 Clandestine Stations, 45 Classification, 54 Clausewitz, Karl von, 28, 30 Clay, General Lucius D., 189 Cleavage, 143 Cleveland, Grover, 49 Cold War, 244, 286, 298 Description, 247 in Asia, 264 Nature, 248 Origins, 248 to 249 Outcome, 254 Termination, 253 Warfare Within, 249 Combined Chiefs of Staff, 174, 194 Command Function, 98 Commanders, American Theaters, 168 Commando, 24 Commands, Contingency, 234 Commands, to Enemy Forces, 233 Commissioner General for Southeast Asia, 264 Committee for a Free Asia, 273 FF Committee for a Free Europe, 273 FF Common Causes, 282 Communist Appeals, 246 Communist Goal, 262 to 263 Communist-dominated governments, 294 Communist Manifesto, 74 Communism, 71, 78 Communist Party, 126 Communists, 155, 186 Confederate States, 24, 29 Confucianism, 78 Conquest of Probability, 251, 253 Consolidation Company, 302 Consolidation Plans, 201 Consolidation Propaganda, 46 Continental Congress, 158 Contingency Plans, 202 Conversion, Process of, 13 Conversionary Propaganda, 46 Coordination, 201 Coordination of U.S. Facilities, 272 Coordinator of Information, 90 Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, 182 Cortez, Hernan, 17, 252 Counter-Espionage, 85, 225 Counterfeiting, 209 Countermeasures to Black, 60 Counter-Propaganda, 46 Defensive, 146 Instructions, 144 Initiative, 60 Counter-Subversion, 225 Covert Operations, 255 in Peacetime, 297 Covert Propaganda, 44 Credenda, 186 Creel Committee, 67 Creel, George, 64 Crisol, Jose, 259 Cromwell, Oliver, 16 Crow, Karl, 103 Czechoslovakia, 41, 64, 81 Dalai Lama, 168 Davidson, Philip, 21 Davis, Elmer, 93, 178 Davis, Jefferson, 30 D-Day, 202 Decision-Making, Factors of, 284 Defeat, Psychological, 194 Democratic, 74 Desertion, 211, 237 Developmental Research, 287 FF in Psy-War, 288 Dien Bien Phu, 261 Diplomacy, 36 dramatic intimidation, 41 directives, 97 distribution, artillery, 192. District Information Services Control Commands, 202 Doenitz, Administrator Karl, 30, 88 Doihara, General Kenji, 187 Dome Agency, 105, Domestic Operations Branch 179 Donovan, General William J., 90 Dub, Leonard W., 38, 39, 97 Doolittle Flyers, 99 Dorgods, 188 Doriot, Jacques, 157 Dunkirk, 164 Dutch in Indonesia, 257 to 259 East India Company, 17 Economic Cooperation Administration, 273 Ed. Anjo, 205 Education, 32 Edwards, A.L., 39 E.I. Surinder, 235 8th Army in Korea, 266 to 267, 303, 305 Eisenhower, Gen. Dwight D., 168, 189 Ellis, Havelock, 291 Enemy Definition, 50 Lifeline, 215 Propaganda Situation, 127 England, 68 Environmental Stimuli, 110 Espionage, 15 Estimate of the Situation, 150 Estimates, written, 161 European Defence Community, 253 European Theatre, 191 Ezekiel, Mordecai, 139 Fact, Slanting, 117 Falsification, Radio, 84 Farrago, Lodi SLAs, 41 Fascismo, 32 Fascist Italian Social Republic, 163 Fascists, 78 Federal Communications Commission, 115 Phase, Herbert, 257 Feldpost Card, 70 Field Maneuvers using Psy-War, 301 Field Manual, 241 Field Operations, 151 Fifth Army, 228 Files, Propaganda, 115 Films, 210 First Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company, 303, 305 to 306 First Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group Assisting Stations, 306 Work in Far East Command, 304 Fisher, Lewis, 79 Fisher, FM, 182, 189 Flensburg, 88 Flexibility in Psy-War, 285 to 286 Food Appeals, 232 Food Propaganda, 152 Force Short of War, 1 Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service, 115 Foreign Information Service, 91 Foreign Operations Administration, 273, 276 4-Minute Men, 68, 14.62 14th Air Force, 168, 186, 231 Fox, Ralph, 15 France, 68 as a future ally, 282 Frederick the Great, 28 Free India, 185 Free India Army, 8, 212 French Foreign Office, 297 French in Indochina, 260 to 262 French Revolution, 23 French Revolutionaries, 20 Freud, Sigmund, 26 Friedrich, Carl J., 78 Friendship in Psy-War, 281 FF from, Eric, 290 Führer, 78 Future of Psy-War, 298 FF Fuses, 170 Gamusho, 204 Galahad Operation, 226 Gallup, Dr. George, 290 Gallup Poll, 141 General Staff, 183 Geneva, 261 Geneva Convention, 203 Genghis Khan, 14 George III, 158 German failure in Ukraine, 293 to 294 German psychological warfare, 41 Germany, 184 black operations, 212 imperial government, 67 naval radio, 88 pastoralization of, 103 U.S. zone, 202 World War II accomplishments, 81 Gideon, 3 gifts, 207 Giles, Herbert A., 110 goals of Psy-War, 299 definition, 151 enemy goals, 127 specific propaganda goals, 151 Goebbels, Paul Joseph, 90. Gorer, Jeffrey, 3, 154 Gray, Gordon, 274 Great Patriotic War, 104 Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, 186 Green, Carlton, 264 Green, Colonel J. Woodall, 266, 301 Grenades, Rifle, 228 Gru, Joseph C., 42 Guam, 187 Guerrilla Warfare, 262 Guidance, 194 Examples, 196 Gurney, Sir Henry, 264 Gustav Siegfried Eins, 205 Guthrie, Edwin, 39, 91 Hague Convention, 203 Hall, Colonel Donald, 267 Han, 7 Han Military Emperor, 5 Han River 265 Harvard College, 297 Haushofer, General Carl, 31 Haha, Lord, 59. 83 Hawaii 203 Headquarters and Headquarters Company, 302 Hegelian Philosophy, 25 Henry, George W., 27 Herodotus, 7 Hers, Major Martin, 212 Hindustani, 11 Hiroshima, 202 Historical Materialism, 32 Hitler, Adolf, 77, 202, 225 Hitlerjugend, 57 Hitler Medal, 57 Ho Chi Minh, 263 Holland, 13, 52, 68 Holy Roman Empire, 15 Homeland Facilities, 204 Honesty as basis of U.S. policy, 282 Howitzers, 228 Hooks, Hukbong Mapag Palayabayan, 259 to 260 Huns, 63 Hunter, Edward, 295 Hymn of Hate, 63 Identification of Propaganda, 116 Identity Cards, 209 Ideology, 8, 31, 79 and Plans, 201 India, 264 Indian-Pakistani Fighting, 255 Indochina, 185, 245 Indo-Chinese War, 255 Indonesia, 47, 52, 185 Indonesia, fighting in, 255, 257 to 259 Indonesia, Republic of, 185 Information Activities of State Department, 269 Information Agencies, Chart, 95 Information Control Commands, 270 Information Control Service, 189 Information, Department of, 64 Information and Education Section, 270 Inner Mongolia, 168, 185 Inquisition, 20. Insanity as a Communist Technique, 295 to 296 Intelligence Director of, 64 Propanal in, 129 Propaganda Intelligence, 132, 197 Inter-Allied Cooperation, 163 Interest, Enemy, 48 Interim Intelligence Information Service, 184 International Information Service, 269 International Propaganda, 46 International Realities, 245 International, 104 Interpretation versus Truth, 117 Interrogation, 145 of Prisoners, 147 Iron Curtain, 244 Irregular Warfare, 287 Islam, 10 Isolationism, 140 Israel, 255 Italy, 68. 214 Landings in, 239 Surrender, 202 Jackson, CD, 276 Jackson Report, 268, 275, 289 Jackson, William, 275 Jacobite Broadcast, 18 Japan, 184 Board of Information, 184 to 185 Black Book, 208 Black Propaganda, 105 Cultural Propaganda, 206 Emperor, 49, 214 Foreign Office, 204 Nostalgic White, 135 Peso Note, 23 Psy-War in World War II, 105 Sad Sack, 213, 216 Surrender, 104 Japan's East Asia, 255 Jenks, Edward, 3 Gisay, 168 Johnson, Lewis, 269 Johnston, Colonel Dana W., 97 Yohokyaku, 34, 184, 204 Joint Chiefs of Staff, 93, 194, 277 Joint Psychological Warfare Committee, 93 Josie, Alex, 264 Joyce, James, 119 Joyce, William. Sihoha, Lord Catchins, 224 Kafka, Franz, 119 Kaiserist Propaganda, 66 Kaltenbach, Fred, 83 Kempeitai, 187 Kinsey Reports, 291 Kiska, 214 Kagelin, Rudolph, 31 Kestler, Arthur, 79 Koop, Theodore, 53 Korea, 184 Korean Conflict, 255, 263, 265 to 266, 269, 280, 286, 294, 301, 303 leaflet deliveries, 306 to 307 loudspeaker sections, 306 upsurge, 288 propaganda policies, 305 Psy-War in, 301 Psy-War officers, 305 radio operations, 306 radio propaganda, 289 Crum, 132 Kublai Khan, 14, 106 Kultur, 63. Kuomintang, 75, 186, 204 Kais, Roger M., 276 Labor Recruitment, 224 Lam, Harold, 15 Laos, 262 Larson, Cedric, 103 Laswell, Harold, 38, 97 Latin America, 68 Latimore, Owen, 15, 183 Laurel, Jose P., 157 Laval, Pierre, 157 Leadership, Defamation of, 155 Leaflets Action Leaflets, 231 anti-exhibit leaflet, 96 anti-radio leaflet, 86 artillery, delivery by, 307 B-29 raids, 168 on Berlin, 57 bombs, 307 bundles, 228 Bunker Hill leaflet, 21 civilian action leaflets, 222 civilian morale leaflet, 215 for civilians, 207 direct reply leaflet, 120 dispensers, 265 distribution, 170, 171 dropping procedures, 192 field procedure, 228 French Communist leaflet, 121 ground distributed leaflets, 86 informational leaflet, 142 loading, 172 map leaflets, 235 morale leaflets, 213 news leaflets, 216 packaged leaflets, 170 Philippine leaflet, 2 production, 190 radio program leaflet, 82 rolling, 169 spot news leaflets, 221 start of war leaflet, 198 surrender leaflets, 230, 236 surrender leaflet, AEF, 70. Surrender leaflet, improved, 239 surrender form, radio, 83 surrender, tactical, leaflets, 235 troop morale leaflet, 212 troop morale leaflet, gray, 214 troop morale leaflet, Nazi, 4 World War I leaflets, 68 Legion of St. George, 84 Leighton, Lieutenant Commander Alexander, 97 Litas, Nathan, 290 Lenin, Nikolai, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, 71, 263 Lenin Old Guard, 205 Leninism, 71 letters, prisoner, 232 Lewis, Wyndham, 77 Leyte Campaign, 123, 169 Lhasa, 168 Liaison Field Liaison, 226 Mechanics of, 227 Liaison Officers, Psy-War, 192, 226 Library of Congress, 137 Leanta University, 30 Limitations on American Psy-War.